What if the financial forces draining your money were not accidents, not market cycles, not policy mistakes, but deliberately engineered mechanisms designed to operate in silence while you continue living your life unaware of what is happening behind the curtain? What if the system you trust, the institutions you rely on, and the rules you believe keep you safe were actually built to move wealth upward with mathematical precision, leaving ordinary people exposed without even realizing they are being targeted? This is the uncomfortable question that sits at the center of modern financial power. How much of what feels natural, inevitable, or just the way the economy works is actually the result of hidden structures activated long ago to siphon value from entire populations? The truth is that financial control rarely looks like control. It disguises itself as stability, regulation, protection, or progress. Yet when you study the patterns, when you track the flow of money instead of the words used to justify decisions, you begin to see something startling. Across centuries, the same small groups activate systems that look different on the surface, but follow identical principles: make debt permanent, make currency weaker over time, make crises profitable, and make the public believe they have no alternative. These forces do not need violence or coercion. They work through trust, repetition, and complexity. They create a world where financial loss feels like personal failure, when in truth it is structural extraction. Think for a moment about every paycheck that buys less each year, every loan that seems impossible to finish paying, every fee, tax, penalty, and adjustment that appears out of nowhere. None of it is random, none of it is neutral. These are the fingerprints of a financial architecture built to operate without resistance. And once it is activated, it runs automatically. You do not have to agree. You do not have to understand. You only have to participate in the economy, and the system does the rest. What you are about to uncover is not just information. It is the blueprint of how wealth quietly shifts upward, while the majority remains unaware of the mechanism draining them. Before we continue, tell me in the comments if you have ever felt that something in the financial system does not add up or seems intentionally confusing. Your experience matters. And while you are here, make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed, because understanding these hidden forces is the first step toward breaking free from them as we move deeper into this investigation, where the origins of these mechanisms reveal even more than most people expect. To understand how these hidden financial forces became so powerful, you need to go back to the moment when money stopped being just a tool of exchange and evolved into a mechanism of influence, control, and silent extraction. The systems that drain wealth today did not appear suddenly. They were carefully constructed over centuries, layer by layer, each generation adding new mechanisms that expanded the reach of a structure already designed to benefit those positioned at the top. When people talk about economic instability, inflation, national debt, or currency weakness as natural phenomena, they are unknowingly repeating narratives created long ago to hide the true origins of these dynamics. It begins with a simple truth: financial power is most effective when it does not look like power. The earliest architects of the modern economic order understood that controlling money directly invited resistance, but controlling the rules around money created obedience. Kingdoms, empires, and eventually governments learned that debts could be transformed into long-term obligations, that currencies could be engineered to lose value in predictable cycles, and that crises could be used to justify the expansion of authority. These tools, once activated, created an economic environment where the public's wealth slowly moved away from them without any need for overt force. As trade expanded and global markets formed, these early mechanisms evolved. Institutions that appeared to protect stability were given authority to shape the flow of credit, regulate the issuance of currency, and determine the cost of borrowing. Financial elites realized that by influencing these structures, they could shape entire economies with decisions invisible to the average person. Inflation became a policy instrument. Debt became a permanent feature rather than a temporary burden. Market cycles became opportunities to transfer assets from the public to the institutions that understood and engineered the rules. Generations later, people struggle financially not because they are irresponsible or unlucky, but because they are operating inside a system intentionally designed to funnel wealth upward through subtle, recurring patterns. These patterns were created long before the modern world, yet they still define everything from interest rates to wages to purchasing power. Once you trace the lines back to their origins, the complexity of today's financial environment begins to look less like an accident and more like a continuation of decisions made centuries ago, decisions that shaped the economic landscape you now depend on. And this historical foundation is only the beginning, because as the mechanisms matured, they became even more sophisticated, paving the way for the next phase where manipulation transforms into something far more strategic and deeply embedded within the everyday functioning of global finance. As the financial mechanisms evolved, the individuals and institutions behind them discovered an even more potent strategy. Instead of simply influencing the rules, they could shape the very perception of how money is supposed to work. This shift marked a turning point. It wasn't enough to create systems that drained wealth. They needed people to believe those systems were normal, inevitable, or even beneficial. That psychological foundation is what allowed modern financial control to expand far beyond anything the early architects could have imagined. The elite didn't just design economic structures, they crafted narratives that kept the public unaware of how deeply manipulated the system had become. Throughout history, each major financial transition was introduced as a solution to a crisis, a necessary reform, or an advancement toward progress. Currencies detached from tangible value were framed as innovations. Expanding national debt was presented as a tool for growth. Centralized control over money was justified as protection against instability. And each time, the public accepted these shifts because they were delivered with the appearance of authority, expertise, and inevitability. This is how power hides, not through secrecy alone, but through convincing the population that the mechanisms working against them are actually working in their favor. Behind the scenes, however, the beneficiaries of these changes were remarkably consistent. A small circle of interconnected interests, bankers, political elites, and financial institutions, positioned themselves to gain from every adjustment to the system. When money became less tied to real value, they benefited from the ability to create credit endlessly. When debt became permanent, they profited from interest flows that never stopped. When markets became global and interconnected, they leveraged inside knowledge and influence to exploit movements before anyone else understood what was happening. The public, meanwhile, was trapped in a financial structure designed to keep them reactive rather than informed. This dynamic became even more powerful as economies modernized. Financial manipulation no longer required overt pressure. It worked through subtle shifts in inflation, interest rates, asset prices, and credit availability. These variables were presented as natural forces, but they were shaped by decisions made in boardrooms and legislative chambers, far removed from public oversight. People experienced the consequences: rising living costs, stagnant wages, increasing debt, but rarely understood the engineered forces behind them. And in that confusion, the system gained even more strength. By the time these patterns became deeply embedded in global finance, the elites no longer needed to adjust the system manually. It ran almost automatically, supported by institutions, laws, and public expectations that kept the machinery turning. Yet this was only the foundation for the next stage, where financial control would move from subtle influence to a fully engineered structure that ensures wealth extraction happens continuously and without resistance. As these financial structures grew more sophisticated, they evolved into something far more calculated than simple economic management. They became a system engineered to create permanent dependency, ensuring that individuals, companies, and entire nations remained locked into cycles of borrowing, repayment, and renewed borrowing. This was not a flaw in the system. It was the design. Debt transformed from a temporary tool into an enduring mechanism that extracted wealth passively and continuously. What began centuries ago as a clever strategy for managing government finances eventually became the foundation of a global architecture, built on obligations that never truly end. The brilliance of this transformation lies in its subtlety. Few people question why national debts never decrease, why individuals spend decades paying interest on loans, or why economic growth requires the constant expansion of credit. These patterns have been normalized to such a degree that most accept them as unavoidable aspects of modern life. But when you analyze the structure closely, you begin to see that debt is not merely a financial instrument, it is a control mechanism. It ensures that wealth flows upward with predictable regularity, regardless of social shifts, political changes, or economic cycles. The system is self-reinforcing, designed so that every crisis increases the dependence on borrowed money. Governments borrow to fund operations, then borrow again to service earlier debt. Individuals borrow for education, housing, transportation, and emergencies, often paying more in interest over time than the original amount they received. Corporations borrow to expand, consolidate, or simply survive market fluctuations. In every case, the interest paid becomes a stream of income for the financial institutions that control the issuance of credit. This structure creates an invisible hierarchy, where those who control debt issuance accumulate power while the rest of society carries the weight of obligations they can never fully escape. The most striking part is how seamlessly this system blends into daily life. People feel the pressure of rising costs, stagnating wages, and increasing financial burdens. But the deeper architecture remains hidden behind a facade of normality. Debt is presented as opportunity, inflation as progress, and dependency as responsibility. The result is a population conditioned to navigate an economic maze built by those who benefit from every turn the public makes. And the more the system expands, the harder it becomes to trace the roots of the extraction, because the mechanisms now operate globally, intertwined with every aspect of modern finance. This is why understanding these forces is not just useful, it is essential. Recognizing how debt was transformed into a silent, perpetual tool of extraction is the first step toward understanding the larger pattern that shapes the financial world today. And as you reflect on this, share in the comments whether you've ever noticed how normalized these cycles feel, even when they clearly work against the average person. Your perspective adds depth to this investigation, and it helps us move forward as we continue unveiling what lies beneath the surface of the system. As the global financial system advanced into the modern era, the mechanisms of extraction became more sophisticated, less visible, and vastly more efficient. What once depended on physical currency, tangible resources, and direct lending evolved into digital instruments capable of reshaping entire economies with a single adjustment. The institutions controlling these instruments no longer needed to operate through overt pressure or political influence. They had something far more powerful: the ability to manipulate the cost of money itself. And with that capability, they could create conditions that enrich the system while placing ever greater burdens on the public. Interest rates became one of the most effective tools in this transformation. The subtle shift of a percentage point could alter the price of homes, the expansion of businesses, the strength of currencies, and the stability of nations. Yet these decisions were rarely understood by the public because they were presented as technical necessities rather than deliberate strategic choices. The narrative was always the same: protect stability, control inflation, manage growth. But behind these phrases was an arrangement that redistributed wealth upward each time the financial levers were pulled. When interest rates were lowered, borrowing surged and asset prices inflated, benefiting those who already owned substantial investments. When rates were raised, debt became more expensive, slowing the economy and placing pressure on ordinary households, while institutional investors repositioned themselves for profit. Inflation, too, became a controlled instrument, rather than a natural occurrence. As currencies gradually lost purchasing power, wages failed to keep pace, creating a silent erosion of wealth that affected millions without triggering immediate alarm. People noticed their money buying less, but they rarely questioned the deeper reasons behind the shift. Inflation allowed governments to service debts more easily, while reducing the real value of savings held by the public. This dynamic was particularly impactful on those least prepared to absorb the loss, turning everyday life into a balancing act where financial security felt increasingly out of reach. Meanwhile, complex financial products emerged, designed not for public benefit but to maximize extraction opportunities. Derivatives, structured debt, and speculative instruments created layers of activity that appeared disconnected from daily life, but had profound effects on markets, employment, and long-term stability. These innovations allowed institutions to profit whether markets rose or fell, insulating them from risk while leaving consumers exposed to the consequences. The system rewarded volatility, uncertainty, and perpetual credit expansion because these conditions generated continuous opportunities for gain. At this stage, the machinery of modern finance had reached an extraordinary level of refinement. It operated quietly, invisibly, automatically, adjusting billions of outcomes through a handful of mechanisms that only a small circle fully understood. And while the system promised efficiency and prosperity, the reality was that it deepened dependency and widened the gap between those who shaped the rules and those who lived under them. This is the environment that set the stage for a far more dramatic shift, one where institutions would no longer merely influence economic behavior. They would engineer entire patterns of global interdependence that ensured the flow of wealth continued in one direction. As the financial system expanded and intertwined across continents, a new phase emerged, one where governments, central banks, corporations, and global institutions were no longer operating independently, but instead functioning as parts of a single self-reinforcing machine. This interconnected structure allowed the flow of money, debt, and influence to circulate in predictable cycles, creating a loop where each component strengthened the others. The result was a network so deeply integrated that no single nation or institution could fully step outside it without destabilizing itself. This was the moment when financial power became something more than influence. It became architecture. In this architecture, governments relied on central banks to stabilize their economies. Central banks relied on financial markets to transmit policy decisions. Corporations relied on easy credit to expand operations. And global institutions relied on sovereign debt to shape geopolitical outcomes. The cycle appeared rational on the surface, even necessary. But beneath it was a design that kept all participants in a continuous state of dependence. Borrowing funded spending, spending justified more borrowing, and every new round of debt creation fed the institutions that profited from issuance, interest, and market volatility. The machine thrived on momentum, and every crisis only accelerated its growth. This interdependence also meant that financial decisions made in one part of the world could ripple across oceans within seconds. A policy shift in a major economy could destabilize markets in emerging nations. Currency adjustments in one region could trigger capital flight in another. And through it all, those who understood the structure could anticipate these movements, positioning themselves to benefit from fluctuations that devastated ordinary citizens. Globalization was often framed as a force for prosperity, but in the financial realm, it functioned as a mechanism that magnified both influence and extraction. What made this cycle even more powerful was the illusion of separation. People saw governments, banks, corporations, and global institutions as distinct entities with competing interests. Yet, when you followed the flow of money, the overlap became undeniable. The same influential actors shaped policy discussions, advised governments, directed investment strategies, and controlled vast pools of capital. The boundaries between public and private power blurred, forming a unified financial ecosystem where decisions were made by a concentrated group whose interests aligned perfectly with the continued expansion of the system. This is why every crisis, whether economic, political, or social, resulted in outcomes that strengthened the architecture rather than weakening it. Governments responded with stimulus funded by debt. Central banks intervened with liquidity injections. Corporations consolidated market share. And global institutions imposed restructuring programs that reinforced long-term dependency. The machine absorbed shocks, adapted, and emerged larger and more resilient each time. And while the public believed the system was being rescued, the truth was that the system was rescuing itself. This convergence of interests created a financial environment where extraction was not just possible, but guaranteed. And as this cycle grew, the impact on individuals became impossible to ignore, paving the way for the next phase, where the pressure created by this architecture would fall directly on ordinary people who had no understanding of the forces shaping their daily financial struggles. As the global financial architecture tightened its grip, the consequences began falling hardest on those with the least ability to defend themselves. Ordinary citizens, workers, families, small businesses, became the shock absorbers of a system designed to protect itself first and extract value second. What makes this shift so insidious is that it rarely appears as deliberate harm. Instead, it presents itself through everyday struggles that feel personal, isolated, and unrelated. Rising living costs, shrinking savings, stagnant wages, and financial goals that move further out of reach with every passing year. These burdens are not random. They are the downstream effects of mechanisms engineered far above the level of individual awareness. People often sense something is wrong without being able to identify the source. They work harder but feel poorer. They follow financial advice yet fall behind. They sacrifice, budget, save, and still experience pressure that seems disconnected from their efforts. This dissonance is not a coincidence. It is the result of an environment where inflation slowly erodes purchasing power, credit dependence becomes normalized, housing becomes speculative rather than accessible, and essential goods rise in price faster than wages can adjust. The system extracts value gradually, predictably, and invisibly, leaving individuals believing their struggles reflect personal shortcomings rather than structural design. Even the tools that promise financial empowerment often reinforce the cycle. Credit cards offer convenience, but they lock people into high-interest traps. Student loans promise opportunity, but they extend financial dependency for decades. Mortgages offer stability, yet they tie families to market conditions they cannot influence. Every solution is engineered with built-in vulnerability. The more people rely on these instruments to navigate modern life, the more deeply they become embedded in an ecosystem that prioritizes profit generation over personal security. Meanwhile, economic shocks, once rare, have become cyclical events that reset the system at the expense of the public. Recessions wipe out savings, while institutional investors buy distressed assets at discounts. Market crashes eliminate retirement funds, while financial elites reposition themselves for the rebound. Crises serve as gateways for consolidation, regulation shifts, and new financial products that generate even more extraction. And each time, the narrative blames individuals for not preparing adequately, concealing the reality that the system itself is designed to shift risk downward and reward upward. The psychological impact is profound. When financial pressure becomes constant, people experience stress, confusion, and resignation. They adapt to instability as if it were normal, because the underlying machinery is never visible enough to question. This emotional acceptance is the final layer of the trap, when the public internalizes struggle as a personal failing rather than recognizing it as the outcome of forces working far beyond their control. And as you reflect on this reality, share in the comments whether you've ever felt that your financial challenges were part of something bigger than personal decisions. Your insights help expand the conversation as we continue uncovering how these forces shape everyday life. As these financial forces tightened their influence across nations and economies, another pattern emerged, one far more subtle but immensely powerful: their ability to adapt to crises with remarkable speed, precision, and strategic advantage. Each downturn, each collapse, each geopolitical shock became an opportunity for these mechanisms to expand rather than weaken. While ordinary people experienced crises as destabilizing moments that disrupted their lives, the institutions guiding the system experienced them as recalibration points, critical junctures where the architecture could be strengthened, extended, and refined. Crises reveal vulnerabilities, but they also create openings for new forms of control. When markets fall, the public panics, but financial elites position themselves to acquire assets at prices far below intrinsic value. When currencies weaken, households lose purchasing power, but institutional investors seize global opportunities that emerge from the imbalance. When governments face deficits, citizens endure austerity, but the architects of the system gain leverage through bond markets, international lending, and restructuring. Demands. Every disruption, rather than threatening the system, appears to reinforce its foundations. This adaptability hinges on information, coordination, and speed. Institutions with access to real-time data, advanced forecasting models, and geopolitical intelligence can shift positions instantaneously. Meanwhile, individuals and small businesses move reactively, constrained by uncertainty and limited resources. Even policymakers, who theoretically should defend the public interest, often rely on guidance from the same financial actors who benefit from each reset. This alignment ensures that the system does not merely survive crises, it grows more resilient to them while becoming more extractive. But the most striking element is psychological. Crises create fear, and in fear, populations become more willing to accept policies, programs, and financial structures they would normally resist. Extraordinary measures suddenly appear reasonable. Expanded authority seems necessary. New forms of debt appear unavoidable. And behind every perceived emergency lies another opportunity for institutions to embed themselves deeper into national and global economic frameworks. What begins as temporary solutions slowly transforms into permanent features. Over time, this cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Globalization, technological acceleration, and interconnected markets create conditions where crises travel faster and hit harder. But the system's capacity to exploit them grows proportionately. The public experiences instability as chaos, while the financial architecture experiences it as renewal. This divergence marks one of the most important distinctions of the modern era. The same events that weaken ordinary people simultaneously fortify the mechanisms extracting value from them. And while many believe that crises reset the playing field, the truth is far more unbalanced. These events serve as catalysts, allowing financial forces to adapt, expand, and evolve in ways that keep them firmly ahead of the population they influence. This adaptability is what leads directly into the next phase, where extraction becomes not just structural or economic, but psychological, shaping the perceptions and expectations of millions without them realizing how deeply affected they are. As these financial mechanisms expanded their reach, their most powerful dimension emerged not in markets, institutions, or policy decisions, but in the minds of the people living under them. The true strength of the system was never just its structure. It was the psychological environment it created, one that shaped expectations, perceptions, and beliefs so subtly that the public internalized limitations without ever realizing they had been imposed. Financial pressure became a mental state, a lens through which individuals interpreted their own struggles, often blaming themselves for conditions intentionally engineered far beyond their control. This psychological conditioning begins early, woven into the norms of modern life. People are taught that success depends on constant effort, resilience, and personal discipline, yet the economic landscape they operate in is already tilted against them. They chase rising costs with stagnant wages, take on debt to achieve basic milestones, and adapt to an environment where financial insecurity is normalized. Over time, this creates a deep-rooted belief that struggle is natural, that scarcity is standard, and that falling behind is an individual failure rather than the outcome of structural forces shaping the entire system. This mindset is reinforced through repetition. When inflation erodes purchasing power, the narrative blames mismanagement of personal finances. When housing becomes unaffordable, the message is simply to work harder or be more disciplined. When credit becomes a necessity instead of a tool, people are told it reflects their choices rather than systemic design. In this environment, individuals internalize guilt and stress, while the true sources of pressure remain invisible. The system ensures that the public never identifies the architecture behind the burden. Media, education, and cultural narratives play a profound role in maintaining this perception. Financial literacy is often reduced to budgeting tips or motivational slogans, while the deeper mechanics of monetary policy, institutional incentives, and global financial coordination remain obscured. This creates a gap in understanding that allows extraction to continue without resistance. When people do not see the architecture, they cannot question it. When they do not question it, they continue participating in the very mechanisms that undermine their financial stability. This psychological dynamic is not accidental. A population that feels uncertain, confused, or overwhelmed is easier to guide, more compliant, and less likely to challenge the structures shaping its reality. The system relies on this emotional foundation to maintain its influence. Stress, insecurity, and financial fatigue become tools that reinforce dependency, making individuals more accepting of unfavorable conditions simply because they see no alternative. And when people believe they have no alternative, the architecture becomes nearly impossible to disrupt. This silent psychological influence prepares the ground for the final layer of understanding, where the true nature of the system becomes clear, and where the possibility of breaking the cycle begins, not through force, but through awareness of how deeply these hidden forces shape the world we live in. When you finally step back and observe the full architecture, its origins, its evolution, its adaptations, and its psychological influence, you begin to see that these hidden financial forces were never isolated pieces. They were parts of a single design, a system built to function quietly beneath everyday life, shaping decisions, outcomes, and expectations without ever revealing the blueprint behind the pressure most people feel. This understanding is not meant to provoke fear, but clarity. Because once you see how these mechanisms operate, you can no longer mistake structural extraction for personal failure. You begin to understand why progress feels slow, why stability feels fragile, and why the financial world seems engineered to move in one direction. This clarity is powerful. It allows you to recognize how global institutions adjust their strategies during times of crisis, how central banks influence the value of your savings, how inflation shapes your purchasing power, and how the debt cycle reinforces itself even when the public believes the economy is stabilizing. It allows you to interpret economic events not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a long-term pattern designed to preserve the system's continuity. And most importantly, it reveals that the forces shaping your financial reality are not beyond comprehension. They simply rely on remaining unseen. But awareness alone is not the endpoint. It is the beginning of a shift in how you interpret the world around you. When you understand the architecture, you stop reacting blindly to financial pressure and start recognizing the underlying mechanisms that create it. You begin seeing the distinction between what you can control and what has been engineered. You recognize the signs of orchestrated instability, the cycles of extraction, and the psychological narratives that keep populations compliant. And in that recognition, a new sense of agency emerges. Not because the system becomes less complex, but because it becomes visible. This visibility matters. It transforms the way you make decisions, the way you view risk, and the way you prepare for the future. It allows you to detach from the false belief that struggle reflects inadequacy and instead see it as the product of a structure designed to channel wealth upward with mathematical efficiency. Understanding this pattern gives you leverage, not over the system itself, but over your place within it. And that shift, subtle as it seems, is what opens the door to resilience in a world shaped by forces most people never examine. And if you reach this point, leave a comment saying, "I see the pattern," because that awareness is what separates those who feel trapped from those who begin to understand the machinery behind the pressure. If this message brought you clarity or helped you connect the dots, consider subscribing to the channel so you can continue exploring these hidden structures with me. And if the content resonated with you, a like helps this investigation reach more people who are caught in the same cycle. There's a video waiting for you right here that expands on the forces shaping today's economy. Click on it and continue this journey with me. Because once you start seeing the pattern, everything around you begins to make more sense.